not only like retired fossil sites, but other good infrastructure sites that the EDP could literally start going around in their regular economic development work in coordination with VNEC and use as a tool to market. And it's difficult because this isn't a wholesale electricity market too, right? So you have to, obviously you would have to have buy-in from Dominion or Appalachian Power. But it moves us in that direction, I agree.
Yeah, and that still goes, I think, with the authority and the VNEC's mission is to make that happen. And, it was things like 3 years ago. We had our first meeting, that's 3 years ago, Economic Development Partnership. It is, I do really believe that they see that there's something here and there's a resource that we really need to take care of and make and have Virginia go further.
So I have one other question. It's more of a process question. Does anybody else have questions or input on the hub proposal itself? So let me take this in 2 steps. So in terms of the process for the hub, is there anything, I know you talked about potential proposals with the legislature is for the next session. Is there components of the proposal, or would this be separate in terms of outreach to both the Virginia legislature, but I would also say to kind of the federal delegation, whether that be DOE or the Virginia delegation? Is that part of the proposal, or would that be something separate as kind of implementation?
We're trying to get a meeting with the Department of Energy right now. There has been some indications that they would like to meet with us. I actually got word for another thing just earlier this week that the Department of Energy recommended VNEC to speak on a panel. So I know they're aware of what we're doing. We would like to sit down with them. We just haven't been able to make that happen yet. But that is something that's been we've been working on trying to get. So I know there's interest from them. Yes, and I have talked to the federal delegation members to let them know what we've been doing. I will be following up again and just letting them know and making them aware of our efforts.
Okay. Then a question on the proposal process. So I would imagine, so when there's a draft to share, I think logistically, and I'll look at Grant and Larry to make sure we're okay here, but it would be probably easiest if you sent that draft to Brandy and she distributed it to the authority with comments coming back directly to you.
Yes.
Does that make sense, April? Grant, we're okay there, right?
Yeah, as long as it's a one-to-one.
Right, one-to-one, not sending it to the whole, not sending the whole group, but each individual member can provide comments back to April. And you can, or if you want to deem someone from the proposal writing team, we can always do that too.
No, I'll take it.
Whatever's easiest. And then what will be the kind of finalization and distribution process? Do we know that?
Well, we still have to go back to the working group.
Okay.
I did have a working group meeting. One thing I learned at that working group meeting is that the universities had to have some things more spelled out to have discussions with that larger group. So we'll have to have a working group meeting, get more feedback from them, and get changes, and then probably get everyone's edits, have everyone look at it again, and then we will hand it over. I'm on timing. I just not even willing to say what timing is going to be. Where I thought I've known a couple of times. It just hasn't worked as planned, but I, again, will say, they're having good conversations, and I'm glad that we're having them now, rather than a year from now. I think we'll be in a better place because of them.
Okay. So I think the next step for this group is to watch for draft to come from Brandy for comments back to April. And then with that, in terms of timing, we'll kind of see where that falls in terms of our first quarter meeting, but also any sort of, because I don't believe that VNECA has any sort of need for approval, voting on the proposal. This is the hub's proposal. I don't think we sign off or not. But the only other thing I would recommend is you do, because we're getting close to where we're going to have a transition to the new legislature and administration. I would talk to them and see what their process is they're going to want us to. This is an opportunity, and you don't want to be surprising anyone as they're coming in. So, in terms of reviews, I know there's been involvement from entities, but just make sure they're in the loop before anything kind of goes out publicly.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Any other questions on the hub?
And then on a lighter note, I hope that this year, hopefully we don't know yet what the legislature is going to look like on people actually being in the building, but we're hoping to have the students back this year and do our day on the hill again. That's been very successful. One of our, it's a great thing for us in the industry to take students on it to meet legislators. So hoping we can still do this year. So we're in the planning process, but we're waiting to hear what the rules will be.
Yep.
That's it.
That's everybody.
Yep.
Okay, so the next thing is the annual report status. Brandy, I can probably provide that unless you want to.
I'm sorry?
That annual report, basically, it's been distributed.
Yeah, Commerce and Trade came back on Monday and approved the report as is without any recommended changes. So I distributed the annual report yesterday to the governor, the chairs of the House and Senate Committee, as well as the National Library Archive. So it's a done deal.
Great.
And we're only 2 weeks behind, so I was very happy with that.
Pretty good.
Can you all just circulate whatever's the final?
It's going to be on the website.
Oh, okay.
Everything, all the materials will be posted on the website.
All right, so next up we'll do the meeting minutes. You have a copy in your packet, so we'll take a few minutes. If anybody has comments, we'll take them. But
And we now have a quorum.
yes, we do.
That's what the church is about.
Motion. Second from Andrew. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? All right, great. And so then there's also the asset inventory copy is in the packet as well. Just want to do a check. Rich, you said we had an update for Liberty.
Yeah, our president is now Gary Crizo. We are also offering master's and PhD programs in engineering.
Maybe just make sure Brandy has the link.
I think we have it.
Sounds good.
Any other updates that folks?
I already mentioned this, but the UVA data in the report is actually correct. It's more recent than what's in this handout.
Great. Okay, so we'll make sure.
I'll make sure they do that.
I did want to spend just a couple minutes on planning for next year. So you may have seen the article that Brandy sent out this morning from Sama, who is former chair of VNEC, VCU professor, and now is, what's her exact title of that?
President of the World Nuclear Association.
Association, something. Anyway, I had talked to Sama earlier this year about speaking to this group. She has a very good interest now that we know we can kind of do this hybrid mode. She is on the list. I'm going to reach out to her once we have dates for meetings next year to try to get her as a speaker. We've also, as April mentioned, we've had conversations with Dr. Huff at DOE about either her or someone from her leadership team is interested in speaking with VNECA too to kind of share their vision. So those are two that are high on the list. Are there other speakers that folks we can talk about that now? Gene, the other one we had talked about was, why am I blanking on it? I think that's Steve. Yeah, Steve Nesbitt, sorry. I don't know what I was thinking of. But it might be worthwhile for Steve, especially following the winter meeting that they have now, to provide an update. And I don't know if there are others that we would be interested in putting on the list for invites next year. I know we've said this before, but my goal would be to have at least one speaker at each of our meetings to kick things off.
Third way would be interesting.
How about one of the SMR companies?
Okay. Stop them off and making a list here.
Actually, it would be interesting, just, I know either way, see you guys are opening up your research, it would be interesting to get, like, even for Avatar, just getting little updates from industry, the companies themselves that come and speak to this stuff that's going on. Jane Joe would be great. You do good with Joe.
Reach out. For what we were talking about.
So, you mentioned Terra Power, not necessarily getting an update on Natrium, but I do think, they're pursuing their demo as a coal replacement. I know I don't know if you caught there was a Nuclear Matters presentation that they did jointly about that project, but I actually wasn't able to tune into that. But
Who was the?
Jeff Navin, I know, did it from the Terra Power perspective, but there was a representative from Pacific Corp, I believe, as well, who owns the site that they're looking at converting from. So that might be an interesting angle, kind of that coal to nuclear discussion. That might be an interesting one.
Yeah, Terra Power would be interesting because they have sort of what I'll call multiple pursuits.
Yeah.
So they're coming at from several different angles,
Right.
slightly different reactors.
All right, well, that's a pretty good list. Maybe what I'll do is I'll pull this together. I'll send it to Brandy. She can distribute it, and if others, we'll kind of try to keep it as a working list for the next year. But with that, we have a calendar here. Again, I think what Brandy, I will ask you to do is I would like to try to schedule the first two meetings, the first quarter and the second quarter meeting. But I also think what would be easier, rather than us all going around the room right now, is we send a doodle poll and maybe let's target the end of January, first part of February, initially, Brandy, for the first quarter. So maybe we look at like the weeks of, the 24th, 31st, and 7th. those might be some options. That way it also gives us some time on the proposal too. And then we look at kind of maybe mid-April for Q2. And let's go from there, and at least maybe we can get those on the calendar.
When's the legislature in session? What's, April, do you know?
Second Wednesday in January.
So we'd be on. That's fine, I was just curious.
Do you know how long it goes? Is this year?
This is Larry, is this a short session?
This is a long session.
Long
Yeah, this is long.
So I think it's to March 12th or 15th, somewhere like that.
So yeah, that would actually be good then. So if we look at
Still
right after it
yeah,
starts, and then we
yeah.
could do some in April, it'd be after they wrapped. So, okay. Good. All right, so we will do that. Any other nuclear news, company updates, organization updates that you wanted to share? Scott, you guys are doing all sorts of things.
Well, Randy pushed it around, but we call it the BWXD Innovation Campus, which is adjacent on our non-ethos site. We do all naval reactors, work and some other things. So it's part of our nuclear services group or advanced technologies, which is more things that fit in probably more this group and this group's interest, but a nice grant to the county. And then for Campbell County, and then also, I think it's called the Senate grant as well. But anyway, we're hoping to attract about 100 new hires and try to move some people over there, and that'll evolve over time. But
Great. Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
So,
That's great. It's growing.
yeah.
So I guess in terms of overall news, probably most people know this, but in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has been signed, there is a substantial, there's two very important things for nuclear in there. One is that the ARDP funding has now been finalized. So it's all authorized all the way to the end of the program, and it's been put into a separate part of the DOE budget, not requiring NE to have to justify it each year. So that's good, and that does pretty much solidify the two ARDP projects plus the risk reduction projects to move forward.
Well, it only funds, just to clarify,
Yeah.
funds the two
Right.
tier one, or pathway one as they call it.
Correct.
But
So,
frees up all sorts of money for us.
well,
Possibly.
but the idea that
Yes.
NE doesn't have to keep fighting for it each year is good, because otherwise it ends up detracting from other things that NE is doing or could be doing. And then, of course, the other piece is a $6 billion fund for credits for plants that are in economic trouble. That probably won't apply to the Virginia plants, because the Virginia plants are not in a wholesale competitive market, although the language in the legislation doesn't require that. So I've been working pretty closely with DOE. They had a group put together to try to figure out how to word this thing, and there will be an RFI coming out shortly, probably in the next 2 weeks, where DOE is going to publish their expected framework for how this is going to work, and we'll see what happens there. But it does suggest that those plants around the country who anticipate that they may have economic issues over the next, and it's a 4-year program, so it's not intended as a permanent market correction, but it's intended as a stopgap measure. So those plants that consider that they may have some problems will have an opportunity to apply.
And you may not be able to say because we have to wait for the RFI, but I know one of the issues that the utilities had raised with this concept, as opposed to the tax credit proposal in the Build Back Better framework, is this was an annual program that they would have to reapply for. So if they apply in FY22, that's great, they can get funding, they have to come back in FY23. So from a nuclear operator standpoint in a wholesale market, that's hard for them to make long-term decisions because they're in a 3-year look ahead. Anyway, not saying it's not workable, but is there any opportunity to find a fix on that?
Yeah, so actually, the legislation doesn't require that, and so therefore DOE is not proposing it.
Okay, good.
So what it says is that you have to apply for a 4-year period. And there is a requirement that DOE periodically audit, but it doesn't even define what periodically means. So that's up to DOE to determine. So it requires that DOE periodically audit the plants to determine whether economic conditions were such that in the absence of those credits, they would have
Still been above the line.
still been above the line or not.
Gotcha.
And the RFI is intended to be extraordinarily expansive in the definition of what all those terms mean, to reduce the probability of having to go back and make past corrections. Now, of course, if the market changes, and the market may indeed be changing, the price of natural gas is going up. So if the price of natural gas goes up, then a lot of these market dynamics may change anyway. But anyway, the RFI is going to go out. The RFI has been written. It is currently under general counsel review, so I can't really say what's in it. But the intent is to make it as expansive as possible in terms of who can apply, what the definition of economic distress is, and also to make the application process as solid as possible with minimizing the opportunities for annual variations. Because it is anticipated, if a plant has a refueling outage in a particular year, then their generation is less that year, and they're going to have to change the economics. You don't really want to do it on an annual basis. That's
Right. No, that's really good to hear. I'm glad. I know there was some discussion of it, but there was some question of how they would actually logistically be able to do it. So that's really good.
So look, watch out for the RFI. And the idea was to have it out quickly, and then, of course, once general counsel gets involved, everything slows down. So, but they definitely, Katie Huck has indicated that she is not going home for Christmas without this thing issued. So
As long as she also issues the Halo one, that would be great too.
Yeah.
Because that one's been in the works.
well, they did issue the consent-based siting thing. So
I know, yeah.
Yeah,
So
so
they
they're-
got one out on used fuel, but not on the front end.
yeah, they're getting stuff.
No, the Halo one's been funny because the back and forth between OMP and then inside Forestall has been.
All right.
quite
So you mentioned Natrium at Camera, that's a good thing. The other piece that probably you haven't heard is that OPG in Canada today announced that they have selected GEH as their company. So that changes the dynamics too, because GEH clearly had a funding problem in terms of developing their product. Now that they have a committed partner, that does make them more competitive in the U.S. market. So once again, it changes.
Another potential SMR out there, yeah. Great. Others? And yeah, we talked about it last time, but the Build Back Better proposal, which is the follow-on to the infrastructure bill, has, well, the bill that's passed the House, and we'll see where it goes in the Senate, but the energy, especially the nuclear energy provisions, I believe, have pretty broad support, even with Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, who kind of hold the keys to this one. They're significant. Let's not, there's $500 million in there for HALO infrastructure. There is tax incentives that move towards clean energy definitions and emissions definitions as opposed to technology, which is, I think, long-term aligns with the way the market's going. So that's great. And there's even production tax credits potentially for existing nuclear, which
Senator Manchin spoke at the A&S meeting yesterday and sounded quite supportive, actually.
yeah, I think, there's the potential they could even expand some of the HALO funding. I think there's a recognition now of not only the domestic, but the geopolitical need to solve that problem finally. So it's a good thing. Scott, I don't know if you...
But will they get it passed?
Stop. I don't predict that anymore. I don't predict that anymore. Ask Senator Manchin. Anything else? Okay, if there aren't any other comments, we will open it up for public comments.